Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, Spencer Stewart, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Diligence Boardroom Resources and the co-founder and editor-at-large of Corporate Board Member magazine. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the show, and we're filming here from the Conference Board studios in New York. And today we have an interesting topic. We're going to be getting what I call a Washington, D.C. update on corporate structure and governance update. And joining me is somebody who I go back fairly far with, Paul.
Yeah.
It's Paul Atkins, who's the former SEC commissioner and the current CEO of Patomak Global Partners. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, TK.
So it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
That's great.
And I
Thank you very
think
much.
that there's so many issues swirling around. We'll try and sort of get this within our allotted time. But the first one I want to talk to you about is the proxy access discussions and the roundtables that are going on at the SEC. They're looking at the current voting process. You know, is it accurate? They're looking at the no-name stuff, the shareholder proposals, and maybe the most emotional issue of all is the proxy advisors, okay, specifically targeted at ISS and Glass Lewis. So when you look at all that's happening with those roundtables and when you hear what the commissioners are saying, what do you think is going to be the result of all these roundtables?
Well, we'll see. So, like you said, the SEC just had a roundtable recently, and I thought it was well attended and well followed by all sorts of folks because, you know, obviously there are a lot of people interested in corporate governance. But it focused really on three main issues, and so it's really, I call this in general proxy plumbing is what
Right.
a lot of people are referring to it as. So it's the nuts and bolts of how shareholder proposals and other aspects of corporate governance are treated and the rules around that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I think there are a lot of issues that have been kicking around with SEC for a number of years, like how shareholder proposals are treated and decided on whether or not they should actually be placed onto the proxy card for people to vote on or not. Those rules have kind of changed over the years, and it's developed a lot more interest and importance because these days institutional investors control more than, in some measurements, like 70% of all the shares that are outstanding versus going back, say, 25 years, it was maybe 50%. 50% individuals, 50% institutions. So part of, I think, what the SEC is going to be focusing on is with shareholder proposals, resubmission thresholds, for example, how often and under what rules should they be resubmitted year after year. Looking at proxy advisory firms, there are mainly two big ones, and there are a couple others who are nipping at their heels. But the power, the lack of transparency that they have of those particular things, and then the underlying rules that help create this. So I think it's a good time for the SEC to refocus on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are interested in what's going to come out of that, and it'll be interesting to watch. And I know even today there are companies that have 85% institutional holders, percentage of holders.
Basis,
so
right.
It's that whole proxy plumbing is worth an evaluation. So it's probably timely. So I wanted to ask you about another thing that's swirling around. This for me was a little bit of a surprise when Senator Warren, presented a bill that I guess the best way to describe it is that she was asking for federal chartering of companies of a certain size, and looking at everything from political contributions to sustainable investing. Some of them were, I'll put tolerable in the sense of businesses looking at that. One that just, to me, one part of the legislation was this guideline that 40% of the board had to be elected by employees. Well, I'm sure the U.S. Chamber and the Business Roundtable will have something to say if that keeps moving down the pike, but this seems like a pretty far out there proposal. Is there something behind, I mean, is there a medium space that they're trying to get to, or what was your reaction when you saw this?
Well, you have to realize a bill is, depends on the circumstances, but a bill is relatively far away from actual enacted legislation. And a lot of these ideas have been kicking around for many years, and Senator Warren's put them into one package. The one that you mentioned there about, 40% of a board should be chosen by employees, harkens to some of in Germany and the Netherlands, for example, Mitbestimmung it's called, which is a relationship between the employees and the corporation, and they have a two-tier board, and so on the supervisory board, it's called, there's a certain percentage that needs to be representative of workers. So that hasn't been in at least Anglo-Saxon corporate governance at all. It's mainly the primacy of the shareholders versus employees. And so this is sort of a move towards a more inclusive aspect with respect to workers. So to the extent that gets away from shareholders, who are the ones who ultimately are holding the bag with the company, if it goes bankrupt or whatever, they lose their shirts, generally speaking. So employees have a different relationship with the company. So that's going to be a big debate, not just, I think, from the Business Roundtable and Chamber of Commerce and business interests, but I think from shareholders as well, because that's going to affect the type of risk that people are looking at when they invest money into companies, and I think it will obviously affect the relationship between shareholders and their companies.
Yeah. Well, if we see more of what happened with GM recently about the big cuts, that's going to sort of build on the case of saying it's not only the shareholders that are affected when these things happen to companies, so there should be some interesting banter back and forth, I'm sure, on this. But
well, for sure. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's no surprise, though, that Warren is taking sort of the union position in this to simplify it down, that is getting more employee involvement.
Well, the one thing to remember is that there are other ways that employees can be involved in corporate decision making and making a company better. Total quality management, Six Sigma, those sorts of things that follow from W. Edwards Deming's philosophy is one way. That's that doesn't then traipse onto corporate governance.
Yeah. So we have about 3 minutes left, and I know there's, and I will try and get as much into this as we can, but the one thing I wanted to make sure I asked you about is, maybe a month ago or so, 3 weeks to a month ago, there was an announcement that CalPERS had changed its leadership, had made a decision to out with the old, in with the new, because they felt that the old regime was becoming too political in the sense of where and where not they would invest the fund's money, and the return was poor. Right. And so the new, I guess somebody ran on the platform that said, listen, all we should care about is the return. That's our obligation as the fund. So the constituency sort of backed that theory, and in comes a new CEO, I think it was. But that in the movement of ESG, okay, that's a very interesting event, okay, that would happen. So do you see that kind of pressure coming on other, investors like CalPERS? What's your take when you saw that?
Well, I had an article, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal here a few weeks ago with respect to this particular election. So it was, I think, pretty significant that CalPERS and all that it's done over the past few years with respect to some of these, I call them non-material, non really economic sorts of shareholder proposals and other things, initiatives, have faced a bit of opposition because you had a fellow, Mr. Perez, who's the head of a policeman's union, a police union in California City, beat the incumbent board member who had been one of the leaders with respect to some of these initiatives. And he basically ran on a platform saying we're paying too much attention to non-material, non-economic things, and we need to get back to our knitting, because he said, quote unquote, I want to retire, meaning he wants to have a retirement that he can count on. And so we know that every little bit counts, whether it be fees or whatnot, over a long period. The effect of compounding of investments over time is very important. And when you look at the underfunding, especially of state pension funds, it's pretty scary, because the taxpayers are the ones ultimately who have to pick up the tab at the end of the day, to the extent that investments don't return the money to the bottom line to basically fund the pensions that the politicians have promised to state employees. So that's what it comes down to. I think Mr. Perez has his emphasis in the right place, to be worried about the performance overall versus other non-material, non-economic sorts of issues.
Well, California is not the only state whose retirement fund is underfunded.
No, that's true. Illinois and others are way worse than some of the California.
So this could be the beginning of some kind of pushback if others are following suit with these non-economic issues taking too much control, I assume.
I think if the beneficiaries, like here in this particular case, understand what it means for their pension fund to be underfunded and the danger that they face, because taxpayers may not pick up the tab ultimately. In some states, they're required to by their state constitution, but it's very dangerous, I think, for the ultimate beneficiaries of these funds to go off on frolic and detours, basically on non-material sorts of things. Their investment advisors need to focus on the bottom line, ultimately.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. I know you and your team always have your fingers and are touching what's happening there in Washington, D.C., and there's just a plethora of issues. So it's always helpful when you come on and sort of explain that to our group. So thanks for joining us.
Happy to do it. Thank you very much.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms, brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, Spencer Stewart, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.